inclusive, particularly of girls, when we start talking about that, we talk in ways that are problematically essentialist. So I'm going to define that term in a moment. Gender essentialism is this idea that because of the gender you were assigned at birth, usually boy or girl, you will have particular interests and particular ways that you like to express yourself. And in the CS Ed community, we want to be more welcoming to girls, generally. And once we start talking about that, we have, at the very least, decided that, well, making everything pink is definitely not being more welcoming to girls. Girls are not just pink. And we have, at the very least, I think, as generally a CS education community, stopped doing that. But we do still have this basic idea that girls want to change the world. And girls like to tell stories and, are more artistic or whatever. And it is certainly true that CS education in the past had not valued enough how artistic and expressive and world-changing computer science could be. And it is certainly important that we tell all students that CS is world-changing and creative and artistic and all of those things, because there are boys who are less interested in CS because they didn't realize that they could change the world with it. And then I also think it is super important that there are girls who like video games and sci-fi and geeky things. As someone who frequently walked into CS classrooms and looked around and saw, mostly boys, I would feel intimidated by those classes and have stereotype threat thoughts along the lines of, I can't ask questions because I would prove to people that people who aren't boys are not as good at this. So I would be terrified of asking questions.
Right.
But I'm a sci-fi loving competitive geek. And I always described it to people as I'm far more of a geek than I ever was a girl. In fact, it was the fact that computer science classrooms were frequently places that were full of sci-fi loving geeks that made me feel at home. And every CS education conference I have ever been to has told me, well, you're weird, and that's why you're here. But girls don't like those things and need you to do these other things. And there is a large extent where that feels like erasure of many girls who do like these things, and in what it means to be a girl, and in what it means to be a boy, and also in the fact that you'll have students that are neither girls nor boys. There's lots of non-binary people, and if we continue to talk in this way about girls wanting to save the world and boys wanting to make video games and being geeky, we have defined what it means to be a boy and what it means to be a girl. And I think what we are trying to do is to stop defining what it means to be a boy and what it means to be a girl, and to instead make the computer science space more open to everyone, regardless of what their interests are and regardless of how they identify gender-wise. So I think it is super important that we as computer science teachers stop using gendered language. More students will be interested if we bring the storytelling into our CS classrooms. More musicians will be interested if we show students that AI can use music, right? We don't need to say more girls will blah, blah, blah. And this is generally my rant as someone who at this point in life identifies as non-binary, but for quite some time identified as, girl in tech, and kept hearing oh, no. Girls don't like sci-fi, etc., etc. Please don't do that to your children. You are totally erasing people's identities and who they are, and what you are meaning to be doing is the reverse. So let's be more inclusive of all people who are interested in things that are not traditionally what we associate with tech, and stop making that about a given gender per se. And in the meantime, do invite more people who you assume to be girls into your classroom. do invite people, do make sure that you are not using gendered language generally. Some of the things that we do to try to encourage girls will in fact encourage more people in general if we stop doing this whole thing where we have assigned what girls like. I think end rant.
Yeah, I kind of fear that. So right now, there's not a lot of discussion on people who identify outside of the binary in education. Like a lot of research, they don't even ask those questions, which is a whole different topic. But I kind of fear that, okay, if it is discussed now, okay, there are male, there are female, and then there are people who identify outside of that categorization. I fear that they will essentialize non-binary individuals as yourself and myself into, okay, well, girls like this, boys like this, non-binary kids will probably like this. And I know it's all well-intentioned, like in terms of they mean the best. When some people ask me the curriculum that I developed, okay, well, what projects are really good for girls? And I'll bring up this some examples where, okay, in the classes that I worked with, there were kids who were working on this project that was basically a dress-up game, in that they created this thing where you could click on the different articles of clothing and then it would create a different costume for this character. And who engaged in that? Well, it was boys, actually. And then, okay, well, there was this car game that was like, it was a race car game, and these kids added in stuff like different turbo boosts, and like, if you drive into the grass, it slows you down, and like oil slicks and things like that. And who engaged in that? Well, girls did, actually.
Yes.
I try and bring up those examples to say, like, those are typically associated with an essentialization of the opposite gender of what actually engaged in them. So the projects that I create, I say, okay, I take into account different identities in terms of interests, but I'm not going with these heritable assumptions and saying, okay, I assume boys will like this project, girls will like this project, and non-binaries will like this project. But just go with, well, kids who are interested in dance would probably like this dance project. Kids who are interested in music would probably like this music project.
Absolutely.
I know it's kind of a non-answer that people are looking for, but it's the truth. Like, based on my experience in the classroom and my experience as a curriculum developer, that's just what I've learned to go with.
And you make more people feel welcome.
Right.
If you are assuming, well, people who are interested in race cars are going to build this race car project, then if you are assuming boys are going to be interested in this race car project, well, then, like, if you're not a boy and you were interested in the race car project, suddenly you're not anymore.
This excerpt was from episode 13 of the CSK8 podcast titled AI for All, Curriculum Development and Gender Discourse with Sarah Judd, which you can find on any podcast platform just by searching for CSK8 podcast or by simply going to jaredoleary.com, where you'll find hundreds more podcast episodes on computer science education.